Consultant, so I got to see if my slides. Oh, yes. Whew, I need my crush. I got a little nervous for a second. First off, huge thank you to Sam and the BEA board for your continued and consistent leadership at this critical moment in the struggle, but also in our country's history. I will start by saying that I didn't know I was going to come and speak to a bunch of my friends, which is great, but also a little bit more intimidating. I can say I've had the honor and the privilege of probably spending legitimate time with half the people in this room. And it is a true honor to be side by side in this fight with you. And that's why I'm optimistic. So I'm going to do a little bit of a state of diversity, equity, inclusion. It'll be brief to set the context for some wonderful people following me, including Uncle Mark. I'm so glad I'm going before you and not after you. I know better than that. Okay, so I think the Attorney General made some reference to this, but we are going through one of those moments in our history where we've experienced a burst of momentum, and the context of that is quite unfortunate. We know, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others, but that really set us on a bit of an acceleration. You saw companies really out in front because their employees were demanding it, making commitments to hire, and maybe more importantly, making significant financial commitments to racial equity. And you saw that continue. We as Mckinsey have been cataloging it. The number got up to around $340 billion of committed investment. And some of that stuff has played out, some of it hasn't. We'll come back to that. But then we had this SCOTUS ruling. And we know that the SCOTUS ruling was limited in its scope, but we also saw significant backlash and significant retrenchment in corporate America. And so we started to see in some instances scaling back of DEI as a function and the role. We saw people get a little softer on their commitments, and we saw a lot more legal challenges pop up that forced people to roll back programs. And so that's the context of where we are today. That being said, I think we are seeing a mix of different things and different statements and actions by companies. You are seeing some really roll back, and I talked to lots of different executives at different companies, and you are seeing instances where people are diluting the eligibility of programs. They have a program that targets sophomore students that are diverse, and now it's just a sophomore program. And then you actually see the numbers play out in the first year, and the numbers for Black students, Hispanic students drops precipitously. You are seeing some program contraction and some slowdown in the hiring that's starting to play out. Others, and I think it's truly the ones that have been committed, are actually using this opportunity to lean in to win the war for talent. And so you're seeing some companies actually accelerate their hiring of diverse employees. You're also seeing, even in instances where companies have taken the diversity part out of their talking points, they're leaning into inclusion, and they're actually including a lot of the stuff that we would think of as representation in that bucket. And you are seeing more data collection. You may have seen the CBC under Congressman Horsford's guidance put out a strongly worded letter soliciting responses from companies, laying out whether they're being responsive to their commitments that they made and how they're progressing on their diversity commitments. And so we hope that more data collection and transparency will keep this top of mind. As I said, many companies remain committed. So if you look back in the run-up to the SCOTUS decision, people said, were these commitments real? Were we making progress? The answer is yes. When we actually looked at the data, of the 300,000 jobs that were added in the S&P 100 over this defined time period, 94% were actually for diverse talent. You're seeing organizations after the SCOTUS ruling say they're going to continue to focus on inclusion and culture. And again, I think much of what we hope for on diversity is being rebranded in some context as inclusion, and we need to stay on companies to make sure they're meeting that commitment. And then companies remain committed. 94% of organizations are actually increasing or maintaining their DEI budget over the past few years. I want to stop on this because this is really important and it's gotten some recent press attention. For the last 15 years, we have led, as Mckinsey, some research looking at the business benefits of diversity, where we sought to understand, is there correlation between diverse representation and financial performance, both in terms of gender representation as well as ethnic diversity. We've done this study over many years. It is not a political analysis. In fact, recently it's been under attack as a couple of academics who are funded with some folks with some political intentions have tried to dispute this, and they found some excited Twitter Twitter warriors to kind of say that McKinsey misrepresented. We stand firmly on this analysis. And in fact, I want to make one thing very clear. This analysis was not about looking at specifically the US. We looked across 15 countries. We defined what diversity of representation ethnically meant in each of those countries. Then we looked at 1,200 global companies, and we said, companies who have top quartile diversity in their institution versus bottom quartile, how do they perform? And it's correlation, but we see a very strong correlation for outperformance. And we'd invite anyone to audit our approach and submit their own results more publicly for what they've done in their analysis. So we know there's significant opportunity and business benefit from embracing more diversity and more inclusion. But yet we know that many are not acting. And we know that the gaps remain very stark in all aspects of Black American life. So there's a few of the stats here. 43% of workers are in jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year. I found it so frustrating when people would talk about financial financial literacy. It's important, but it doesn't matter how financially literate you are. If you're making $30,000 a year, you can't get by. And we just need to push back on the stereotypes and the misrepresentations. On business ownership, only 2% of businesses that have more than one employee are Black owned. We're missing out on about $1.5 trillion of revenues that should be flowing into diverse owned businesses. That's not just equity value for the owners of those businesses. We know that diverse businesses tend to hire more diverse workforces, situate their assets in underserved communities, and so we're missing significant benefit. And then, of course, this life expectancy gap is probably the most important number on the page, which is these economic things have consequences downstream. So we're missing millions of Black people that should be alive today that are not here, largely because of the upstream economic disparities that our society has allowed to persist for so long. We recently did a look to understand at a very granular level, at a place and county level, what does parity look like? What kind of progress have we made? And how long should we expect to have to wait to get to parity? I think the magnitude even shocked us, even as students of this space. The good news is, across all different types of counties, we have made progress over the last 2 years. The bad news is that progress is woefully insufficient. And if we just played forward the current rate of progress, we said, how long would it take in these different community types for us to actually reach parity with our non-Black neighbors? And you can see there, it's anywhere from 100 to 320 years. So to me, that makes urgent that we have to shift the rate at which we're engaging. We have to think more boldly and dramatically about the interventions and solutions. And we cannot give a single inch in this moment, because even today at the current rate of progress, it won't be in our great-great-great-grandchildren's lifetimes. So I want to just end on a few things. We talk a lot about representation in corporate America. And there's no doubt that DEI in the traditional sense is important. But we cannot solely be focused on more roles in the C-suite. We need to be thinking about raising the floor as well as lifting the ceiling. And so I think we've got to be pushing not just the wonderful partners in philanthropy, many of whom are in this room who I have great respect for, but also the private sector to think differently about their role. It's not just about hiring. How can the private sector play more specifically and more deliberately in our education systems? You know, I think the Nicole Hannah-Jones quote is one of the best. I got so many friends who work in this city, and I respect and love them, and they say, I can't send my kid to that school. I got to send this other private school. If you can't send your kid to that school, why would we send any kids to that school? And so what are we willing to do about that? What are we willing to do about health equity, about creating financial products and services like my friend Wole from Okafai is doing to address the real problem of the underbanked and the credit invisible? And so we've got to think more about more than just hiring. How are we going to invest in the ecosystem and pillars that are going to significantly change outcomes for our children and for generations behind them? Thank you.